Most people in Europe were illiterate. Most people in the Muslim world at the time were literate.
After Islamic invasions of India, when the Indian universities were gone and they burnt manuscripts, there weren't that many copies.
After the death of the Prophet, that there were multiple Qurans floating around, and then that the Caliph Uthman declared that we're only going to have one.
The evangelical missionaries are battling evangelical Muslims for souls in Africa, and the evangelical Christians are winning big time in South America.
Islam is also the transmitter of Hindu numerals from India, and the concept of zero from India.
Welcome to For Talks. With me is Bryn Barnard. He is an artist, he is an illustrator, he's a speaker, he's a teacher. He has lived around the world. He has been an artist for NASA. I could carry on with his rather impressive bio, but today we are going to speak on a topic which will interest many. The topic is the genius of Islam and its recent struggles. And the reason we are talking to Bryn about this topic is because in 2011, he published a book called The Genius of Islam, How Muslims Made the Modern World. So Bryn, welcome. Happy New Year to you. This is the first interview we are doing in 2026.
Oh, well, I'm honored. And Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, sir. Bryn, so why did you write this book, and what period does your book cover?
I was an exchange student to Malaysia, 1973-74, and I lived with a Malay Muslim family in the southern state of Johor, quite conservative, very observant, and so I was exposed at age 17 to a very intense experience living with Muslims, and a very sympathetic experience.
This is fellowship at Iqra, right? Or
no, that actually came later.
Okay,
that came later. No, so this was this was through AFS, the American Field Service. It was a year going to high school, studying with Malaysians during the day, Chinese, Indians, Malays, and then going home to my Malay family and doing what they did on evenings and weekends and stuff. It happened that my Malay family they were shamans, so I got a real introduction to sort of Malay traditional culture along the way.
So, hold fire. They were Muslims and shamans.
And shamans as well, yeah, shamans as well.
That's curiously syncretic, because conservative Islam doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, it's a very syncretic. Malaysia is a very syncretic. Traditionally, Malay Islam has been quite syncretic because Malaysia was animist, then Hindu. It was part of Greater India, Buddhist, and then in about the 13th century, Islam arrived, and so it had only been in Malaysia for about 200 years when the Portuguese arrived in the 1500s, and then the Portuguese followed by the Dutch, followed by the British. So in the course of any week, I'd be seeing things. I would ask, is this Muslim or is this Malay? In a birth ceremony or a wedding ceremony or various other things. And my host mother had a practice where people would come to her home during the week, and they would ask for guidance or cures for a wandering spouse, a domestic discord, and she would find a sentence from the Quran and write it on a piece of paper, roll it up, and put it in a bottle of water and give this to the person. So this is very Sufi, this is, and when Islam arrived in Malaysia, it was originally very Sufi. Mm-hmm. This also happened to be about the time when the Saudis were really accelerating their missionary effort to expand Wahhabi Islam into Southeast Asia. So there were these people that they called Datwa that dressed in long robes, and they had goatees and turbans, and you would see them here and there on the streets, and you'd see their cassettes in the night market, and they were preaching a very different form of Islam that wanted to strip Malay Islam of all of this syncretism and go back to a very puritanical 7th century version of the religion, as it was at the time in Saudi Arabia. And over time, that took hold. I'll talk more about that later.
Yeah. It took hold even in Indonesia. It didn't just take hold in Malaysia.
Yeah. Oh yeah, all throughout the Muslim world. Frankly, I'd say it's been a very successful missionary effort from top to bottom. For example, in my host family, if you see the picture that they sent me when we were negotiating over this student visit, the family portrait that they went to the family studio, everyone was wearing more or less Western dress, and no one had any head covering. And one of my host sisters passed away recently, and I found those pictures and I sent them to my relatives there, and they posted them on Facebook, but not before with a marker, adding in like a little hijab around the face. And so now that's
airbrushing history. That's basically what Stalin did.
Yeah. So
they've all turned into mini Stalins.
So now, in the if you went to Kuala Lumpur or Johor Bahru, any city, not veiled, but an unhijabed woman, a Malay woman, Muslim woman, is quite rare. Not unheard of, but I still have quite a few friends in Kuala Lumpur who don't wear the hijab, but it's definitely the minority.
I mean, this is the trend, right? The headscarf has made a comeback, even in Turkey, of all places.
Yeah, in secular Turkey, right?
Really pushed for a secular republic.
Yeah, but it's. I think with the success of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that was literally the spark that lit this. Even though the Iranians and the
Shia
and the Saudis, they're Shia, the Saudis are Sunni,
yep.
they're rivals, but that created an opening for Saudi the missionary effort to really accelerate.
1979, our viewers may not know, is also the year when the Grand Mosque at Mecca was seized and terrorists held a lot of people hostage. So 79 is a momentous year in the Islamic world.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So I went back to Malaysia so I finished in 74. I went back in 1981 to 84 on the ICWA Fellowship, the Institute of Current World Affairs. And there I was, instead of Johor Bahru, I was living in Kuala Lumpur. Started in Kuala Lumpur and went to other cities in Southeast Asia, looking at visual communication in Southeast Asia. So I worked in an ad agency. I wanted to see how foreign corporations used local culture to sell their products. So, for example, I followed ad campaigns like the McDonald's ad campaign, the Wendy's ad campaign, the Sun Silk ad campaign. And I was in the agency, and since I had gotten out of art school and I was an illustrator, I was doing illustrations in the ad agency and then writing about it for the Institute. Over the course of 2 years, I had 24 newsletters. So I spent a year in Kuala Lumpur and a year in Jakarta. Oh, and I forgot. Yeah, in between, I went back again, and I did a junior year abroad at the University of Science Malaysia, and there I was in
you were an undergrad at Berkeley.
Yeah, I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and I was doing field research for my thesis, and I did 6 months as a member of a shadow puppet theater troupe that had been set up. It was an experiment to see if they could instead of doing the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the two great Indian epics, that they would do Malay stories, and instead of having Kelantanese, who are Kelantan is the northeast coast of Malaysia. It's the state where shadow puppet theater is still quite popular. They were doing it in the west coast in Penang with Malays, Chinese, Indians, all mixed together, and this foreigner in the shadow puppet theater troupe. So I did that for 6 months, and then I went to Java and I studied batik, wax resist printing. And that was the basis for my, the batik part was the basis for my senior thesis. Then the ICWA fellowship, then I had a Fulbright and went back again. So anyway, about 10 years all told, living in Malaysia. So when
and that got you interested in Islamic art, and
yes, Islamic art, Islamic culture. That was the germ, yeah. So 9/11 happens. I'm raising my family on San Juan Island, which is not far from Seattle, and I read in the paper that a Sikh gas station attendant has been murdered in Seattle by some local white guy who sees the turban and says, "Oh, you're a Muslim, and we're gonna, revenge." And I started reading more and more stories of people being terrorized, or people perceived as Muslims being terrorized in the U.S. So I went to our local school superintendent, and I said, "Well, I lived in Malaysia, and I actually have lived experience there. I'd like to talk to our local schools about my experience there. Would that be okay?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. Go talk to the principals." So I started with the middle school, then the high school, then the elementary school, and then our local community college. And it's far enough back in time when I was using slides. It was actually a slideshow, and I was showing my slides, and just show them this was what my life was like, this is what my family was like, this is what the mosque was like. Asked some kids in the audience what their names were, wrote it in Arabic on the board, because in the Malays, although Malay is written normally in Romi these days, Romanized characters, it can also be written in Jawi, which is Arabic characters. And so I learned how to do that. And it was completely positive reception from everybody. I didn't get any hostility and pushback. So when I was approached by Random House to write and illustrate books, one of my proposals was for a book about the Islamic world. And as it turned out, I did 2 books before this. I did one book on plagues that changed history, and another book on natural disasters that changed history. And then I did The Genius of Islam, which was about, as I said, how Muslims made the modern world, which is not about it's not about the religion of Islam per se. It's about the civilization, about Muslim civilization, and how Muslims, the close interconnection between the Islamic civilization and the West. For the first 500 years of Islam's evolution. And
they took over. Let's be honest. They took over the Eastern Roman Empire. Really, they took over. The Byzantine Empire, which was in a period of disarray, and they took over the Iranian Empire. I mean, the collapse of these 2 empires allowed for the expansion of Islam.
Well, there were a lot of confluences that made it this happen easily. About a century before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad was the Justinian plague, which depopulated the Eastern Mediterranean. And we think this is quite possibly bubonic plague, not sure, but it upended the Emperor Justinian's plans to basically rebuild the Roman Empire. And so when, after the Arabian Peninsula had been consolidated by Muslims and the Muslim armies came out of the peninsula, there was not a lot of pushback. There was not a lot of military presence, so cities fell quite easily. Starting in the Levant and then moving into Central Asia and also North Africa, and so within a century, by the time you get to within a century of the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, you basically have achieved that footprint of the Eastern Roman Empire plus the Maghreb, the North Africa, and then toward the end of at the end of the Umayyad dynasty, there's the Abbasid Revolution, and this is where the capital moves from Damascus to Baghdad. But one survivor of the slaughter of the Umayyad ruling family makes his way to Spain. Where there were already Muslims there. They'd already, but managed to then conquer southern Spain, and so then you get Andalusia with their capital Cordoba, and so at one point in the 10th century, and then we have to go up. Then there's the Fatimids they start a dynasty based in Egypt, and so you have the Fatimids, the Abbasids, and the Umayyads all claiming the caliphate, that they are the direct successors, the legitimate successors to the prophet. Exactly. So that's the beginning. So I wasn't going so much into this, but about inventions and things that people could connect to.
Yeah.
So I can talk about a couple of them if you want to just give you an idea.
You've already explained why you write the book. So explain to us the period, because generally it is held by people who are not historians of the period like me that 1258, when the Mongols sacked Baghdad, and the House of Wisdom goes, so goes the glory, so go the glory years of Islam. After that, it's downhill ever since.
Well, I think yes, but yes and no. I'd say yes and no. So starting with in the 7th century, and with the spread of Islam, they suddenly have this empire, and they need to rule it, and they recognized that they weren't equipped to do this. The ancient Greeks were highly esteemed, and as were the Byzantine Romans were highly esteemed because they'd run an empire. Yeah. So there was this interest.
As had the Persians,
as had the Persians,
and the Persians end up providing the bureaucracy for a lot of these Muslim empires, especially when they come east, because Farsi, not Arabic, is the official language of India. Although India is conquered by Sunni Muslim cavalrymen.
Right. So they spread into these areas, and and there's a project that's already been started, and this was started under the Persians, and this was the translation of Greek knowledge into Syriac, which was the language spoken and written in that area. So the Muslims took over that project, the Arabs took over that project, and expanded it. And that the House of Wisdom that you mentioned was the kind of the apotheosis of that, where we don't actually know what it looked like. We don't know how big or small it was. There's only descriptions of it, but the translators from all over this new empire, people who could, if they could understand ancient Greek or other languages, if they had access to Babylonian or the languages of India or Chinese, they would try and they could get a job in the House of Wisdom. There were other houses of wisdom throughout the Muslim Empire, and it was basically a library like the Library of Alexandria, and a translation center where an ancient text would go from ancient Greek to Syriac to Arabic. And this translation project stretched and pulled Arabic and turned it from a language of poetry, which it had been before Islam, to a language of science and a language of technology. New words had to be invented. The structure of the language changed, and so that it became the lingua franca of the whole empire, and became the language of science. The way that, say, German was the language of science in the early 20th century. If you wanted to see what was cutting edge, you learn German. In those days, if you wanted it was cutting edge, you went to the Muslim world. So Europeans who wanted to learn about what's going on in medicine, what's going on in engineering, what's going on in astronomy, or astrology, what's going on in any of the technological fields, they would travel to the Muslim world, and that's where it was being taught. So there were universities.
This is a period which in Europe is known as the Dark Ages. This is
the Dark Ages. Yeah.
This is the period when you have a very rigid Catholic Church. You have for a while you even have a divided papacy, Avignon, Rome. This is a period of political fragmentation in Europe.
Right. It's probably when Europe was weakest vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Just to give you an example of the difference. So when the Muslim armies went to Central Asia and encountered the Chinese Tang dynasty, they got access to paper-making technology. The Chinese used mulberry leaves. The Arabs used we're escaping me now. It's not hemp, but rag paper. They used rag paper so they would take clothing and they would pound it down. They also found a way of mechanizing the process, so they greatly expanded and accelerated the creation of paper. And they also the ancient Greeks had although they'd invented the codex, they had preferred the rolled manuscript. And in Baghdad, they decided the codex was the better way to store and access knowledge. Instead of having to roll open a manuscript and look where what you're looking for is, you can just flip through the pages. And then they had different sizes of paper for different uses, different weights of paper for different uses. They had bird paper for putting on pigeons and sending them off for the email of the day. And they had different colors of paper that indicate for different bureaucratic aspects. Anyway, this spread throughout the empire. So, and the way they created books was also quite different. In Europe, you have the picture of the monk in the monastery, the solitary monk with the solitary copy, usually of the Bible, that they're copying line by line laboriously. It takes a long time. In the Muslim world, you would have one, because remember I said it was the language of poetry, it was an oral language initially. You have one reciter. You go back to the Quran when the Prophet Muhammad is getting his revelations and he's revealing them. They have groups of people who are memorizing these and they become reciters, and the Quran means the recitation. So this tradition of reciting is transmitted into the secular world, and so you have one reciter reciting a book, and you have scribes around him. So one reciter, 10 scribes, 10 copies. One reciter's 100 scribes, 100 copies at one time. And these get spread throughout the Muslim empire to libraries in Fez and in Cairo and in Marrakesh and Damascus. And so when the sacking of Baghdad it happens, it's not like the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. You don't just, even though supposedly the Euphrates ran black with the ink from the libraries of Baghdad, it was not the end of Muslim knowledge, because they had, and it wasn't.
It's in stark contrast to what happened after Islamic invasions of India, when the Indian universities were gone, and they burnt manuscripts. There weren't that many copies. A lot of Indian knowledge was reconstructed after translating Chinese translation of texts in Pali, Prakrit, and Sanskrit.
To reconstruct. Well, in the case of Islam, there was interest in technology, as I've described, of Greek technology. So Euclid and Hippocrates and all of the, as well as the Plato and Aristotle, but not so much, in fact, not at all really, plays and poetry. So people like Sappho were not translated into Arabic. And so we only, and many poets and so many poets and dramatists, we know them today only by reputation because they weren't translated. Because with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, that's really where they were. They were gone. And so we found, for example, Sappho was found in the wrappings of mummies in Egypt, her writing. And she was considered one of the great poets of the age, of her age, in ancient Greece. So once all of this knowledge had been transmitted, literacy rose. Books were inexpensive, and libraries were enormous. So to get back to my original point is that in Europe, the largest library in Europe in the 10th century. So when you had Cordoba and Baghdad and Cairo all as three separate competing capitals, in Cordoba, one library in the Royal Library was reputed to have 600,000 books in a city with 80 libraries. At the same time, Europe's biggest library had 600 books, and they were written on parchment, and they were chained to the library walls. They were so valuable, and so most people in Europe were illiterate. Most people in the Muslim world at the time were literate. So it was quite a contrast during this period that I'm writing about.
Which centuries? Give us the period.
Oh, so we're talking 7th century is when Islam starts. I'm really talking about the 9th to the 12th century. That's the focus of my book, 9th to the 12th
300
century.
years.
Yeah, 300 years, yeah. And you if you want to be generous, you could actually say 500 years, because it wasn't the fall of Baghdad and everything ends. There was just decline. There was something else that happened too, is that there were two competing groups, the clerics, the ulama, and the philosophers, the falsafa. And they both took this remarkable revelation, the recitation, the Quran, and they explored it in different ways. For the ulama, they were looking at every sentence and every word and every paragraph of the Quran, and using that trying to understand what that meant, and wanted to build a society out of that. And so knowledge of, and this is where Islamic jurisprudence is built out of that. So you got the Quran, and then after the death of the Prophet, you get the Sunnah, which are all of the not revelations, but sayings, or they are oral transmissions of memories about what the Prophet did and said. And so it's hearsay, basically. And so it doesn't, for historians, it's not considered relevant, but for Muslims, they're considered very relevant. So one of the reasons, for example, that in Kuwait, where I lived for 5 years, that you could tell the difference between a parliamentarian who was conservative or a parliamentarian who was progressive was by the length of their robe. So the progressives wore robes that swept the floor, they're dishdasha, and conservatives wore ankle-length robes. And it was also, the progressives had trimmed beards, and the conservatives had longer beards. And because they were dressing in what they believed, based on the hadith, was the way that the Prophet dressed and wore facial hair.
So you were saying that there was this division between the ulama and the falsafa.
Yeah, and the falsafa. And so I talked about the ulama. So now the falsafa, they went in a completely different direction. They wanted to look at God's creation through research, essentially. And so they were looking into that basically, if we look at what's going on in the real world, what can we find that will reinforce or support this revelation? And so they go out of these two groups. They go out of the starting gate at the same time. Unlike, for example, say Christianity. It was very different, where Christianity took over the Roman Empire, the already built mechanism of the Roman Empire and was able to impose itself on the Roman Empire, and so was able to persecute first the Gnostics and unbelievers and push schismatics and heretics to the edge of the empire. In the case of this Muslim world, these two groups were, for the first centuries of Islam, were more or less equal. But by the time we get to the 12th century, you get someone called Al-Ghazali, and he is the rector of the university in Baghdad. He's a mystic. He's a scholar, and he writes a book called "The Aims of the Philosophers," which is what the Greeks were trying to get at, and it's a very fair description of ancient Greek knowledge. And then he writes another book, which basically says they're full of it. You know, that they don't know what they're talking about. And for example, he says in the ancient Greeks talked about cause and effect. That if you take a cotton ball and you light a match underneath it, it will cause the cotton ball to burn. Cause and effect. He says, no. God is creating the world every moment to every moment, and the match lights and the cotton ball burns, and they have nothing to do with one another. So once you get rid of cause and effect, science it doesn't work anymore. So his ideas took off.
He sounds like an Ayatollah Khomeini of his time.
Well, that's maybe in his maybe in his effect. Yeah. I don't think not the kind of person not the kind of person, at least what we know about him. Yeah. So
he wasn't giving fatwas calling for the killing of Salman Rushdie.
No.
But he was similarly conservative and close-minded and completely beset by blind faith.
So the Aims of the Philosophers, translated into Latin, became a bestseller in Europe in the Dark Ages. What that version of the bestseller was, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, his second book, became widely read in the Muslim world. Now, he's not the only reason that there was this decline, and Baghdad isn't the only reason it's declined. But it reached an audience that was receptive to reading it. And then a century later, in Spain, there was another lama and also a falsafa. His name was Ibn Rushd. He's very well known in Spain. Unfortunately, not very well known in the rest of the Muslim world. And he wrote The Incoherence of the Incoherence, which was a response to Al-Ghazali, but it was like too little, too late. By that time, the entire system of belief and support for translation, support for technology, support for the whole edifice of science was declining, and people were putting their money into religion. So, and when I see what's going on in the United States today, with our turning away from science and our turning away from medical knowledge and our belief in sort of irrationality, growing belief in irrationality, it reminds me of that time.
All right. So let's go back to the time you're talking about and tell us about the three main contributions of Islam during this glory period.
Well, there are so many, but I'd say one I've already mentioned, which was the transmission of paper from the Chinese world to the rest of the world, because before then it was parchment, as I've already mentioned. Parchment is very expensive, and a paper has the advantage that when you write on it, the ink sinks into the paper and makes it difficult to counterfeit. Whereas on parchment, you can just scrape it off. You can scrape off the writing with a razor blade or a knife. That's where we get the palimpsests of these old manuscripts that have, it's clear that they've been used multiple times, and the old writing has been scraped off and then rewritten on. In fact, there's a Quran on parchment that was discovered, because parchment was used for very valuable, revered writing like the Quran. There was a Quran that was discovered in Yemen not too many years ago. It was found in the wall of a palace in Yemen that had a palimpsest on it of writing from the Quran that differed from the standard text today. And there's the belief today that it was revealed, it was written down, and that's the way it was. But we know that in the very early years after the death of the Prophet, that there were multiple Qurans floating around, and then that the Caliph Uthman declared that we're only going to have one, we're going to get rid of all the other copies. And so it might have been that this was one of those other copies that was then scraped off. And then survived, yeah. So just as in Christianity, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, they decreed that all the Gnostic Gospels, which had at one time, up until the second century AD, had been part of the Bible, that those had to all be destroyed. And it was in the 1950s that this urn was found in Egypt with the Gnostic Gospels, and then those and it discovered, there's a whole realm of knowledge about the Bible that they're still not accepted as part of the Bible, but they're of great interest historically. So there's paper. That's one. I'd say you probably couldn't leave mathematics out, because Islam is also the transmitter of Hindu numerals from India, and the concept of zero from India to the Mediterranean world, and where up until that time Roman numerals were what were used, and with Roman numerals you can add and subtract. Multiplication, division is hard. Higher math is impossible. But with zero and with the decimal system that came with Hindu numerals, that later became, as far as the Europeans were concerned, Arabic or Hindu Arabic numerals, you could come up with higher math was possible, and then we get algebra and geometry and calculus, and combined with what the Greeks.
The word itself is of Arab origin.
Yes, it is. It's part of the title of a book by a mathematician named Al-Jabari, who a book about one of the first books about algebra. And also there was Al-Uqdisi, who came up with the way that when we multiply and add and subtract and multiply by hand, where you have a line of numbers over another line of numbers, you put however many lines you want, put a line underneath them, and then add them up and carry the number. And that was something that was invented by him. So when you add and subtract that way or multiply that way, you're doing it Al-Uqdisi style. So they made higher math, and everything that comes from higher math came out of that transmission and what was built on that transmission. The numbers that came from the Hindu or from the Indic world to Arabia, and then were spread to Mesopotamia and to Levant and North Africa and eventually Europe, they evolved over time. So the initial numerals looked quite different. And the idea of zero, the Romans didn't have that. It was incomprehensible to them. So that really changed things. And it took, you may have heard of the man named Fibonacci. We have the Fibonacci sequence. He was a medieval Italian who went to North Africa and saw clerks doing this very different system of math, brought it back to Italy, and it spread from another bestseller from there. So that's the second. The third, I think, would probably be the crank and rod. So the wheel was invented in antiquity. We have no idea who really invented that. But adding a crank to the wheel is a Chinese invention. But adding a rod to that crank, which turns circular motion into linear motion, or linear motion into circular motion, is an Arab invention. And there's Al-Jazari, who is an engineer who wrote a book called the Book of Ingenious Inventions. Now, I don't think that anyone thinks that he came up with all those ingenious inventions, but he recorded them. And this is where the first known recording of this crank and rod came from. And from that, you get sewing machines and merry-go-rounds and the steam engine, anything where circular motion is turned into linear motion. And so the basis for, internal combustion engines, internal combustion airplanes, internal combustion boats. When I talk about this in a classroom, I'll say, anyone get here by car? And says, well, you can all thank Al-Jazari for that. And so on and so forth. So those are the three. There are many more. The book has 10 chapters, and so I talk about architecture, I talk about engineering, I talk about food, I talk about music. And then I talk about, at the end, about why we don't remember this. Because as you said, most people, they're not really aware of this. Well, there was a very conscious effort to forget in Europe, especially. The medieval Europeans were aware that the Islamic world was the cutting edge part of the world. But as Europe sort of regained its footing in the Renaissance, and I argue in the book that the Renaissance was kickstarted by the translation of all those books that were translated from Greek and Arabic. There was another translation project that occurred in Spain from Arabic into Latin, and then these books were then spread throughout the European world. So that helped kickstart the Renaissance. As Europeans became more confident, they less and less acknowledged their debt to the Muslim world. And I think you can really see this if you go to the Vatican and you see this great, there's a great painting. It's not a fresco. Yeah, it's a painting that shows it's called it shows all the philosophers of history. And in the middle are Aristotle and Plato, and they're flanked by it's by Raphael, and it's flanked by all the great philosophers of the day and of history. And there's one Arab philosopher, and he's looking over the shoulder of Pythagoras. He's not doing anything. He's not creating anything. He's looking and copying. And this is a form of Renaissance propaganda, saying, and this is like Europe saying, we're back. We're great again.
And indeed, Europe, our podcast on Europe talks about it. Glenn and I, my co-author who retired from the CIA, and I have a podcast called The Dialectic, and one of which is on Europe and Europe's rise and now relative decline. But you've talked about many contributions of Islam. One of the things that you haven't mentioned is, which I hear a lot from scholars on medieval Spain, is irrigation and use of water. Apparently,
absolutely.
The Arabs became pioneers in hydrology.
They did, because they were trading with India, and all of these crops, these tropical crops from India, they had been grown. There was trade between India and Persia, and between India and Arabia, and they a taste for bananas and for rice and for oranges and for watermelons grew in this, and so they wanted to learn not just to trade them but to grow them, and these were relatively dry parts of the world. So you get various different inventions that come out of this. So one of these is the qanat, which are these underground canals, covered canals with periodic openings where you can get in and clean out the canal that go from the mountains where the snow melt is to the cities. And these go for miles and miles and miles with just slight declination so that the water will flow. And then in Persia, these canals would go into a home or into a structure that was used for for creating ice, and called the yakchal. And the yakchal is this big domed structure with this very special kind of cement that was used to build it, with a big pit under it. It means ice pit with a big pit underneath it. And so the qanat goes into the bottom of this, so cool water coming at the bottom, hole in the top to let warm air out. In the wintertime, there was a shallow pond next to the yakchal. They would chop up the ice and stack it inside the yakchal with straw in between, and it would stay icy all summer long. There were so many of these yakchals and so much ice that things like sherbet that comes from Persian, and sorbet and syrup, these are all come from Farsi, they were cheap and available to anyone. I'm working on a book on inventions now, and that's one of my illustrations of that shows a yakchal. And then underneath it, in homes, you would have something called a shabastan, which was like a basement. And this would also bring a qanat in there, bring cool air in. And then you had these wind towers that were built on the homes of the wealthy, and often next to yakchals. And they had openings on all four sides, and openings and closures that you could open and close. So the prevailing winds would hit the tower, and it would create a low pressure zone on the side of the tower opposite the wind. There was something called the Coanda effect, which is what we use for airplanes to rise. And this would pull the cool air up into the house, push the hot air out. And so they had air conditioning this way. So they had both air conditioning, and they had the ability to move water and the ability to super cool things they used it mostly for food, for keeping food, preserving food, and also for these desserts. And that got transmitted to North Africa, and from North Africa to Italy, and then from Italy all the way to the homes of the aristocracy in Europe. So by the time of the Enlightenment, wealthy Enlightenment homes, mansions, like in Britain, they would have these ice houses, and also to the United States. And there's one place called Moseley Park, which in the 1940s was no longer a great house. It was now just open to the public, but they still had the old domed ice house. And there was a young boy who visited there, played around there as a boy, and his name was J.R.R. Tolkien. And they think that the Hobbit house is actually inspired by the ice house, so from the Persian yakchal. So water technology, water engineering, and then how to take that and then irrigate tropical crops in the desert was one of the great achievements of the Muslim world. And then that got transmitted again across North Africa into the Western Umayyad Empire. And then when the Umayyads fell, and during the Reconquista, and their technology was absorbed by the conquering Christians, that was taken in the Age of Discovery all across the world. So that if you can go to Spain today and you can see qanats, Mexico today, you can see qanats and some of the other water moving implements that were developed in the medieval Islamic world there. So it was one of their great contributions.
Excellent. Now, let's move to a topic that is more controversial, especially given the fact that those who draw cartoons of Prophet Muhammad often end up dead, very dead. Mm-hmm. And the prevailing view is that Islam prohibits iconography. Mm-hmm. And yet, I've learned from you that Islam has a rich tradition of painting the human figure, including the Prophet Muhammad. And on the one hand, you've pointed out to me that there are Mughal miniatures, there are Persian miniatures, there are Turkish miniatures, to name just three. And yet, there are limitations to painting, and some would argue these affected sciences like anatomy. My question for you is that how did Islam, in its glory period, managed to paint the human figure, managed to have drawings of the eye, illustrations of the human anatomy, despite the Quranic injunctions to not to paint apparently the human figure. How do you explain this?
Well, the injunctions against painting the human figure are in our hadiths. It's that the prophet
I see.
was said to, and so it was believed that that he discouraged this, and so there was a discouragement of it. So, if you want to be, it's probably easiest to understand that in religious settings, like in mosques or in Qur'ans, that's where the prohibition was really the strongest. So if you go into the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, it's all calligraphy and arabesque and geometry, which are the three great areas of Islamic art that they really evolved to I think the highest degree of any culture. Taking their calligraphy and squashing it and stretching it and developing all these different fonts that they could wrap around any surface, and then both infinitely repeating patterns, but also infinitely non-repeating patterns. So centuries before Sir Arthur Penrose proposed the idea of quasi-crystals that would be unlike a crystal, which is a repeating pattern, but they would be non-repeating. Muslims had figured out a way using geometric forms of creating surfaces of patterns. They appear to be, when you look at them, it's just infinitely repeating. And what you actually realize is that, no, the pattern is continually changing. And there was a young scholar from Harvard who went to Samarkand, and he noticed this on the walls of the great mosque at Samarkand, and wrote a paper on it that made us realize that something was going on mathematically in the Muslim world that allowed them to make this great leap that we didn't get to until the 1960s. So in religious settings, you just don't see the human figure. I think there are probably some exceptions historically, but for the most part, you don't see the human figure.
Yeah.
But in secular settings, that's where the rich tradition of Persian and Indian and Turkish miniatures comes from, and where you see the human figure. And even in stories, there are some stories. It's rare, but you'll see depictions of the prophet, often veiled, so that you don't see his face, or with his face replaced by flames, but not always. And this is true especially in Persia, Iran, where religious figures their faces are often shown, whereas in other places you don't show you don't show the Imam Hussein, you don't show the face of the Imam Hussein, you don't show the face of the Imam Ali, but in the Shia world they do. So that's where you see this thing going on, and this is that's part of the basis for the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia worlds. So as far as as far as anatomy, actually in the medieval period, there was this absolute prohibition against dissecting bodies in the Christian world. Absolutely. That was not the case in the Muslim world. And so they created some of the most advanced medical charts of the time. They were quite sought after in the trade between, even though the Byzantines and the Abbasids and the Umayyads were all fighting with each other, they were also trading with each other. And Muslim medical charts, Arabic medical charts, were highly sought after for their accuracy. They dissected the eye because there were lots of diseases of the eye that were then a problem and are still a problem in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Levant. And so they named all the parts of the eye, which translated into Latin we still use today. So retina is a translation of the original Arabic word, and the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor, those are all translations of the original. And this came from Al-Haytham, who was a scholar who was very interested in light, and he came up with the rules of refraction, the law of refraction, which was essential to understanding how to make lenses. And with the creation of lenses, when that got transmitted to Europe, you get this. That's when you see this real change from the medieval art and Renaissance art. And there's a school of thought that one of the reasons that all of these artists in the Renaissance world were doing these incredible, almost photoreal depictions of the world they were seeing is because they were using lenses. Especially, and this is when you get to like Vermeer, for example. There's a strong case to be made. David Hockney, the artist David Hockney, has written a big book about this. That Vermeer was using lenses he was looking through lenses and using that to take three-dimensional space and turn it into two-dimensional space.
Well, that is very interesting. That there was this division between secular and religious at the time, because that division has gone, or almost gone, in modern times. Even the secular Turkish republic that Kemal Mustafa Ataturk created has now morphed into a neo-Ottoman entity under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And if we look at Malaysia, where you spent time and you explained your youth in Malaysia, Malaysia has self-consciously become an Islamic republic. And when we met first, you said Malaysian architecture was Taj Mahal meets Albert Speer, infamous as Adolf Hitler's architect. And that captured a lot about Mahathir Mohamad's nation-building project. And of course, Mahathir who died at the age of 100, I believe, recently, or 100 plus, is basically the father of modern Malaysia. So the challenge in the Islamic world today is that there isn't that focus on science. There isn't that division between secular and religious, and Muslim states tend to become more and more, for want of a better word, Islamic.
Well, there was this long period, especially during the colonial period, when Muslims all throughout the Muslim world were asking themselves, what went wrong? What did we do? And
very many answers that came out of it. Some of it completely wacky, completely crazy.
But one of the answers was that, we need to modernize. And Ataturk was one of those modernizers. So we need to, we're going to get rid of the Arabic script, and we're going to change to a Romanized script, and we're going to get rid of the fez, and we're going to get rid of the veil, and we're going to really reduce the power of religion. And we're going to emphasize science and technology. And when I went to Malaysia, science and technology, science dan teknologi, was paramount in education.
Your exchange was at that university, which has science in its
name. University Science Malaysia. It was kind of ironic that I was studying the arts. I was studying anthropology and art there, but it was the Science University of Malaysia. And if you were someone who was adept, a good student, you were pushed into the science stream, and to go into a science field and get a science scholarship to study either in Malaysia or abroad, so that Malaysia could be lifted up. And that was, but as that was going on, there was also this push from the religious right that was with the impact of the 1979 revolution that we talked about in Iran, and with the Wahhabi missionary effort that was getting more and more purchase among average regular people. This has happened in cycles throughout Malaysia, and this is one of those cycles between where religious conservatism is on the upswing, and it started on the east coast of Malaysia, which have always been the most conservative, Kelantan and Terengganu, but is now pretty much nationwide, but still the strongest there, where they were pushing for the party PAS, the Islamic Party of Malaysia, has been getting more and more votes in elections, and so for the whatever the party in power is, for them to stay in power, they basically have to throw red meat to the people, to the religious conservatives, so they'll vote for them and not for PAS. Says, why would you vote for PAS? Look at how backward the East Coast is compared to Kuala Lumpur. Here you're going to get all the benefits that we're going to give you. So one of the things they did is they rebuilt Kuala Lumpur from a Chinese British city to the sort of Arab Malay city that it is today, and they took a lot of the impetus for this and the inspiration for this from the British style of Islamic architecture that was based on Fatehpur Sikri, the old Mughal capital, and that briefly occupied Mughal capital, and from Agra and from the Red Fort. The British architects had brought that to Malaysia, so a lot of the new buildings that were being put up, they were expanded versions of that, just incredibly large. And that's where the Albert Speer comment comes from, is that these aren't just like big buildings, these are really big buildings with enormous domes. And Speer was famous for these planned projects for the biggest dome in the world and the biggest stadium in the world, and and of course the Autobahns and all that. So if you go to Kuala Lumpur today, there's still little bits left. There's Petaling Street, which is the old Chinese part of Kuala Lumpur. There's these enormous skyscrapers, and they're either based on Malay cultural phenomena like the kris, which is the Malay knife, or the tengkolok, which is the National Library, which is the sultanic headdress. But a lot of them are domes and towers, and they're covered with Islamic geometry, or with calligraphy, or with arabesque, and so it feels much more like an Arab city, much more like a Dubai or a Doha, than the city that it once was. And this was a very purposeful change. I talked to the people that were doing the master planning. And the master planning of Kuala Lumpur was to de-emphasize the Chinese residential areas, to emphasize the Malay areas, and in addition to just making things look Islamic, they built Saudi-funded institutions and Saudi-funded universities and Saudi-funded think tanks. In fact, there's a TV show, or there was, I think it's off the air now, called Imam Muda, Young Imam, where they take these young guys, I think it's all guys, who want to learn to become imams, and they're competing, like who in the ritual of washing the body, who does that best, and then people call my number, and then they get voted, and whoever gets to be the best, who wins. He doesn't go to Al Azhar University in Cairo to get his religious training. He goes to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And so over the decades, there's been more and more of the religious instruction. So at this point, even though traditionally Malays in Malaysia have been said that they practice Shafi'i, there's Shafi'i, Hanbali, Hanafi, and Maliki. Those are the four schools of jurisprudence. But they're Shafi'is, which is, and as we said, quite syncretic. That now they're very Wahhabi, which is kind of ironic when you look at Saudi Arabia, which is now liberalizing, and to the point in where Malay culture and Islamic culture are so conflated that when people say, when someone's going to convert to Islam, they don't say Masuk Islam, enter Islam. They say Masuk Melayu, become a Malay, and the whole the conservative aspects that we've mentioned before it's almost hard for people to remember what things were like in the past.
So, one of my Pakistani friends has said that he sees Islam as nothing but cultural colonization, Arab cultural colonization. And the reason he makes this argument is that at the end of the day, hardly any Pakistani speaks Arabic, hardly any Malay speaks Arabic, hardly any Indonesian speaks
That's
Arabic.
true. That's true.
And once you get this hardline Islam, which is no longer syncretic, which is no longer about your relationship with God, it is very much what the person speaking Arabic tells you. Because, of course, the Quran is in Arabic, you're pointing your head towards Mecca in praying. And he said the bane of Asia is actually cultural colonization by Islam. And it is creating a rift line that'll see massive wars with neighbors who are still Asian, who haven't really given up on their original identity. What do you say to this friend's argument?
Well, I would say that any evangelical millennialist religion, and Christianity would be the other great example of that.
The evangelical missionaries are battling evangelical Muslims for souls in Africa, and the evangelical Christians are winning big time in South America. South America is turning to the evangelical faith, to Protestantism in large numbers. So we have evangelical traditions around the world now.
But it's also colonial. I mean, it's cultural colonization, because it's bringing in this external faith and this external value system, and it's saying this is right and what you believe is not right.
Yeah.
And so and you need to abandon. If you look at Christianity in the United States as it spread across the United States, indigenous people there were told, who many of whom converted to Christianity, that forget your old ways, forget your language, send your children to these boarding schools where they're going to, as they said, I can't remember who said it, but kill the Indian, save the man. So that the idea was to make them into basically ersatz white people. And if you look at Malaysia, the Christianity in Malaysia is just as colonial as it was brought in before the British, but it's just as colonial in its own way in what it does to the traditions of the people that I know that are Christians. Mm-hmm. What they remember of their traditional culture is limited as well.
But they haven't had much success. They haven't had much success. Malaysia is very much a Muslim society, and the Indians and the Chinese have been completely marginalized.
But they've had great success among the Indians and the Chinese. There's a big evangelical churches, that in replacing Catholicism. So they have had big success there. What's interesting in Malaysia is that the people that I knew that were really working at preserving pre-modern Malay traditions like shadow puppet theater, Ma Marie, which is another performance tradition. The Malay dances were not often non-Malays. One of my friends, Marion de Cruz, who's the founder of Five Arts Center, which is one of Kuala Lumpur's probably edgiest performance organizations, spent her formative years and her master's research looking at royal dance traditions, and she's incorporated a lot of that into her work. So they've been and the people that were in this shadow puppet theater troupe that I mentioned, we were all non-Malay. Then we were Indian and Chinese and two white people who were doing this Malay tradition. And when we performed it in the University of Science of Malaysia, the Cantonese audience wasn't interested because it wasn't in Cantonese, and the Malays were. There was mild interest, and it never really went anywhere. So I would argue that it's not Islam per se. It's this evangelical. Because those two, Islam and Christianity, are sort of reflections of one another. Of this idea that time is linear, not circular, that there's a beginning and an end, that there's Genesis and there's a Judgment Day.
That's very different to the pagan traditions. The Native Americans didn't believe that.
Yeah, which tend to be circular.
Yeah, the Red Indians didn't believe that. The Indians didn't believe that. The Japanese don't believe it. The Chinese and Koreans actually they don't believe it. They have a more of a secular conception of time.
Well, circular, that things are repeating. I mean, this is not, I mean, that's what, this was quite a revolution of thought, the Abrahamic thought, starting with the Jews. There was a beginning and an end. And that time is this thing that is limited. And so, the idea, this is not true of Judaism, but definitely of Christianity, is that you need to go out and you need to convince people of the righteousness of your belief. I had a friend who I used to run with. I'm a runner. When I was in Kuwait, and he was a former evangelical Christian who'd lost his faith. And he said, Brendan, we're running together. In the past, I would have befriended you with only one purpose: to convert you. And I said, now I've got this big hole inside me. I don't know what to do. But he was looking for new purpose.
Well, there we go. Well, let us close on my final question. What is modern Islamic architecture? Because we ended up discussing a little bit of Malaysian architecture. So what is modern Islamic architecture? I leave it to you to decide whether you pick Kuwaiti examples or Malaysian examples or Saudi Arabian examples. Tell us about the current state of Muslim culture.
Okay. Well, architecture is a reflection, like all art, it's a reflection of the culture that creates it. Whether it's if you look at what's going on in Washington D.C. today, with the new ballroom that's going on the White House, and the focus on imperial Roman styling for new Federalist architectures, is a reflection of the thinking of the current administration. And what was going on in Malaysia was this as they were absorbing these ideas about Wahhabi Islam and trying to keep the religious right at bay, they were trying to reflect that, as I've described, in their architecture. I think something different is going on in the Gulf. This is a reflection of their because it's a different situation. They're not multiracial in their citizenry. In Kuwait, the only people who have access to the oil wealth are Kuwaitis. And just a side note there, if you compare Kuwait to, say, Colombia, which we're hearing about all today, Kuwait has done a great job of spreading the wealth. That every Kuwaiti citizen gets basically a universal basic income, a very generous universal basic income.
True.
And so you don't have the kind
and
of...
you get cheap labor from South Asia.
Yeah, and you get cheap labor from South Asia, which is the South and Southeast Asia. And so if you want to look at which would be the equivalent under UBI of our AI future, but they have no access to citizenry. Also, the desert Bedouin they don't have access to Kuwaiti citizenship. Some of them do, but they have these two categories of citizenship: the Hadar, which are the people who were there when Kuwait was originally became Kuwait, and the Baduns, the stateless people. And there's that's really what's going on politically there. If you look at Kuwait up until the invasion, Kuwait was the it girl of the Gulf, and they were building the most glorious buildings and the tallest buildings, and they were planning on putting in a subway, and they were really investing in their country, and they were putting in desal plants, and it was looks like it was on its way to becoming what Dubai is today. But with the Gulf War, they realized this could all be taken away. And so after the Gulf War, people started pulling their money out of Kuwait and investing it overseas. And also the composition of the parliament changed because Kuwait's the only democracy in the Gulf. So they became almost 50% progressive conservatives. And so like our American Congress, they're gridlocked. And that subway has still not been built. It was planned in the 70s, and we're still waiting for it. Whereas if you look at the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain, these are all autocracies where it's the different rulers trying to compete with one another. I think one of the most interesting things that's happened, for the tallest building in the world, the best subway system, the most glittering, glorious reflection of the ruler's glory. The most interesting place, I think, in the Gulf is just actually outside the Gulf is Oman, because there you had one autocrat, the Sultan of Oman, who had a very specific aesthetic vision, which was very different from the rest of the Gulf. He basically mandated a very restrained form of architecture, where essentially the old medieval forts and the castles that became what all the modern buildings were built of, and there were like three shades of white that you could use to build these buildings. Everything was kept very restrained under his watch, and he built this. He was an opera fan, and he built this beautiful opera house, which I visited. I saw La Traviata there, in that same style. It managed to be vast and encompassing, but it wasn't all the glitter and glitz that you see in Dubai and the UAE and Qatar and Doha and Bahrain. The idea of an opera house. Well, he liked opera because he'd been raised on it, and he created this whole education system there to get the Omanis interested in opera. So when they have opera, it's always a full house. La Traviata was full, and they have superscript so people can read it. It's both in Arabic and in English. And before you watch the opera, they have these mini courses where they explain to you the music and they explain the plot. So I went to all of that. So what do you have now? Now you have opera houses throughout the Gulf. Not because they're opera lovers, but because people think, well, to be a modern society, you have to have you need to have opera, and you actually need to have art. And this is, I think, one of the things that's also interesting about what's going on in the Gulf is that some of the architecture, it's not just big tall buildings, but it's buildings devoted to the arts, like the Louvre and the Guggenheim, which are being built there and they're getting Zaya Haddad and some of the world's greatest architects to put up these signature buildings around that. It comes from the autocrat, I think, glorifying their rule. I think that's really what that's. It's not so much a reflection of Islam, but a reflection of the political structure of the Gulf. And one of the reasons you see more of that in the Emirates and less of that in Kuwait, as I said, Kuwait's a democracy. Oman is an outlier, but it makes it just such a lovely country for foreigners to visit because of this. When you travel throughout the country and you see the same kind of buildings again and again and again, repeated in different variations. And I highly recommend it for anyone to visit.
Excellent. So architecture, you say, is a revelation really of culture, and the architecture you're seeing in Muslim countries is, particularly in the Gulf, is a reflection of autocracies. In Malaysia, was a reflection of Mahathir Mohamad's desire to make Malaysia a Muslim republic, an Islamic republic, and what we see in Oman is a more restrained style, a more a style more in keeping with the traditions. And what we see in Kuwait is the gridlock that comes from a society divided between conservatives and progressives.
Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating place to visit, Kuwait, because they have it's a vigorous democracy. They have a very free press. Yeah, things are they love to discuss and to fight out issues. They have frequent changes of government, but unfortunately, one of the byproducts is not a lot gets done. And I could go on. Kuwait could be a whole another podcast.
Another conversation, another time.
Yeah, another
Bryn
conversation.
Barnard, thank you for your time. Thank you for speaking to Fair Observer. Those of you who've liked this conversation, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure that you leave a comment if you are seeing this on our website.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.